Marvel just rebooted Iron Man, and this comic is amazing. And there is one question that I have at the end of it, because I'm curious to see whether or not you guys agree with this. But what this does is this initially opens up with basically building Stark tech, right? That it says, I don't care how dangerous it is. I'm too damn smart to die. In some cave in the middle of nowhere. And he says, okay, right? Time to activate this thing. And he fires up this Mark I Iron Man armor. And he just says, let's go home, baby, and immediately busts out of this place. But as soon as he shows up in the hallway, he gets sprayed down by advanced idea mechanics, right? AIM just shoots this guy to bits, and the armor's not bulletproof. And that's where AIM just says, what a waste. And another guy says, the High Council will be disappointed. And this guy just says, right, please don't, as he's laying on the ground, clearly shot to pieces. And a person comes out of nowhere and says, enough. Only for us to find out it's Whitney. Right? It's Whitney Frost, Madame Masque, and she says, remove our guest's faceplate. And they just say, yes, Madame Masque, and this guy begs. He says, please, I did it. I did what you wanted. I can make the armor stronger, bulletproof. I just need more time. And that's where Whitney just kills him and says, AIM does not need another armor. We want another Tony Stark. Now, here's the thing about Madame Masque. Madame Masque is very much one of these characters where whether or not she's interesting is wholly dependent on who's writing her. She's not like Iron Man or Captain America or Batman or Superman, where by and large, they're always going to be cool. It's just kind of relative to how cool they will be depending on the story. No. There's stories where Madame Masque sucks and there's stories where she's amazing. This is one of the stories where she is amazing. Her and Tony Stark had like just this kind of romantic fling for a little while, but she's one of these kind of freelance guys, always allying herself with what's basically the most capable enemy or group, depending on what her goals happen to be. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a while, because this does kind of jump back to the Stark-Roxxon war here in a little bit. But at that point, you switch over to LA, right? And you got Tony Stark out there basically going to fight against Blizzard. Now, Blizzard is like a C-list guy. I mean, this is a villain you don't normally take seriously. This is one of the villains that Marvel uses to just show what Tony Stark is doing at this particular point in time. And so that's where Tony just says, Blizzard, right? Did you really steal a Roxxon TZ battery pack just to power your new fancy armor? And that's where Blizzard's like, what about it, Stark? And he's like, that model locks up when it's under extreme temperatures. In fact, it releases toxic levels of rapid freezing coolant into the air. So literally he freezes himself, right? By just not paying any attention to what his armor's doing. All while he's trying to get away with just like a duffel bag full of cash. And that's where he's like, I cannot believe it, right? I'm going to die of cold. A guy whose entire shtick is to basically be a villain version of Iceman is going to freeze to death. And that's where Tony just says, don't worry, right? I got just the thing to heat you up, right? You know, Dr. Stark has your medicine. And he just like opens fire on this guy with repulsor blast. And he just tells him, your new Sub-Zero temp tech isn't really all that bad. You just made a mistake. If you're going to steal, you should really steal from Stark. That's really what you should be doing. Now, here's the funny thing about this, and this is what I love, because one of the things to remember is Joshua Williamson is writing this. This is his foray into modern Marvel, kicking things off with Iron Man. And Joshua Williamson is probably one of the top 5 writers in the comic book industry right now. And so what's cool about this is that it's almost Tony Stark kind of giving Blizzard advice on how to become a better villain. Because that's one of the things that Tony Stark is about when it comes to Marvel. Sure, like he fights bad guys, stuff like that. But the one thing that Tony Stark really cares about the most is a person's level of intelligence. Because let's say, for example, that Blizzard were to steal Stark tech, and then he were to reverse engineer it, and then he were to use it to make himself into a better villain that could really rival Stark. Then at that point, Tony Stark would see him as an equal and could on some level try to redeem him like he did with the West Coast Avengers, which was a disastrous attempt in Marvel Comics. It was hilarious. It was such a disaster. But the funny thing here is that at that point, Tony Stark gets a message from Melinda May, right, his new assistant, for lack of a better word. And she says, right, you are late and I have a gun. And that's where Tony just says, she worries too much. I am not going to be late to my own party. And so that's when you realize that the Tony Stark Award is being given away. And Melinda May's kind of pissed about the whole thing. Now, a lot of you guys probably remember Melinda May. She technically appeared in S.H.I.E.L.D. #1 back in 2014 as she was created by Mark Waid, but you most likely remember Melinda May from the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show, right? So she is basically a liaison. To call her an assistant is probably a little degrading, to be honest, but I mean, you'll see over the course of the comic, the role she plays is effectively like a new Pepper Potts for Tony Stark. But it is cool to see that Marvel's continuing her character on, which clearly this is a reference to the fact that the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show is definitely making a return in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But she just kind of screams at Tony Stark, right? Like, get over here now, right? Your favorite band is playing for you, and you're not even here. And so that's where he just says, I am here, Melinda. And she says, where? And he's like, you'll see. And she just tells him, no Iron Man, Tony. The people want Tony Stark. And he's like, but the people love Iron Man. And she's like, yeah, but you promised no armor for this one, Stark. This is a Tony Stark event, and the armor is a safety hazard. And he's like, okay, I promise, no armor. And she's like, what's that sound? And he's like, I mean, you said no armor, right? But I still have to make a dramatic entrance because Tony Stark comes flying into this place in what's probably the dopest motorcycle that I think I've ever seen in my entire life. And he just like sticks his arms out and he's like, look, Ma, no hands, right? This is 100% based on Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark. This is absolutely what he would have done in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. God, I miss that time in the MCU. The first 10 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe remains undefeated. But at that point, he says, introducing the Stark Hoverbike 3000, mass-produced in time for Christmas this year for the kids. So clearly this needs to be created here in the real world, and hopefully I could buy one day. But like, people love him, man. They're like, Tony, right? Hell yeah, like, I love you, Tony. Tony Stark, Tony Stark. Everybody's celebrating this guy, right? The band's going absolutely nuts on stage. Tony Stark's dancing with them, right? He's like, welcome to the first annual Tony Stark Awards. Let's rock and roll, son! It's amazing. And then at that point, Melinda asks him, like, what are you doing, Tony? Right? Get over here. And he's like, see? No armor. I told you I wasn't gonna wear any armor. She's like backstage now, right? And so at that point, there's this whole video package that has been prepared, right? And it just kind of runs over the history of Tony Stark. It's condensed, but it runs over it nonetheless, which is honestly a genius idea by Joshua Williamson, right? And it says, born Anthony Stark, genius inventor, a titan of industry, survivor. When held captive, Tony Stark was gravely injured and knocking on death's door, but that did not stop him from creating the Iron Man armor, a leap forward in armored warfare. Instead of selling the armor to the highest bidder, Tony chose a different path. A member of the Avengers, Iron Man had saved the world countless times. Even when there's tension among his allies, Tony has always strived to do what's right. The armor transformed him into a hero, a leader, a savior, but above all else, Tony Stark is a man of the future, and that is who has brought us together for this monumental evening. And Tony's just kind of like, not bad, right? I could have done without the cat business, but you know, that's it. That's all I've ever really achieved over the course of my life. He's kind of pissy because they haven't covered all the great things that he's done. But that's where this dude shows up, and it's like, Mr. Stark, sorry, sir, but did you see the email about your speech? And Tony's just like, I mean, I don't really read email, but who are you, right? And this guy's like, I'm Brian, sir, like your new personal assistant. And at that point, he's like, May, right? Can't you just be my assistant, right? If you should understand anything by now, Melinda May, it's this. Tony Stark's assistants are always young and beautiful, and women, not dudes. And that's where she's like, I'm no one's assistant, right? Our lovely post-doom government has tasked me with keeping Iron Man out of trouble. So Brian, read your emails too, right? And that's where Tony's just like, okay, well, I don't need anyone to prepare my acceptance speech. I will go out there and give the audience some razzle-dazzle, and I'm quick on my feet like that, right? And that's where she says, it's not an acceptance speech. You're presenting, you're giving the award away. And he's kind of flabbergasted, right? He was like, wait a minute, the Tony Stark Award is not for Tony Stark? And she's like, nope. And he's like, it's for someone else? Like, whose idea was this? And this girl just says, yours. Only for us to find out it's Pepper. Pepper's shown back up here. Now, here's a big thing, right? A lot of you guys are going to ask this question. I've seen it all over social media. Are Tony Stark and Emma Frost not a thing anymore? No, they have not been a thing since the beginning of the Stark-Roxxon War. That's when their whole relationship effectively ended permanently, right? So Tony Stark's flying solo now, right? He's the world's richest bachelor out there in the world. But hopefully him and Pepper Potts end up getting back together again, right? Because she tells him, right, it was your idea with my help, right? Which is basically Pepper Potts' way of saying, like, I created the idea, and then I just kind of presented it as something that you came up with, because I know you, Tony Stark, I know your ego, and you need it to be your idea, right? And so she says, it's good to see you. I heard you were back in the workshop building again. And he says, it's what I'm best at, right? Among other things, right? And she says, I've been maintaining my role at the Maria Stark Foundation, but years ago, you asked me to set up a Tony Stark Grant Award. You handpicked the brightest minds to be awarded a grant, and the recipients who best used the grant money were up for this reward. And so Tony asks, right, so who's the winner? And that's where Pepper says, let me introduce you to Adam Ware. And that's where he's just like, it's incredible to meet you in person, Mr. Stark. And Tony tells him, right, like, I remember you, the teacher, right? You specialize in new educational technologies, finding ways to share master classes with people who might not have access. It's genius work using puzzles and problem solving. And that's where Adam just says, right, that's exactly it. And I'd love for you to come by my classroom sometime. My students could learn a lot from your experiences. And so that's where Tony's like, your tie, right? My father had one just like it when I was a kid. And he just says, it's funny, right? Because my father gave me this one. I can't really afford a fancy one on a teacher's salary. And so that's where Pepper's like, it's time, Tony, right? And he's like, I mean, I don't really have a speech. And she's like, I heard you were quick on your feet, and just pushes him out in front of the crowd. Now, here's kind of the funny sort of juxtaposition between Pepper and Melinda, because for someone like Melinda, she's like, oh my God, he's choking, right? Like, he gets out there, Tony's like, she's like, he's choking. But Pepper knows Tony Stark, right? I mean, they were a thing for a long time in Marvel. And so that's why she's just like, nope, just give him a second, right? He will think of something. He always does. And so he just says, this award, right? This award should really be named after my father. Howard Stark was a lot of things to a lot of people, but most of all, I know that my father shared his genius, his life, and his hope for humanity with as many people as he possibly could. He gave me my name. He worked to give everyone protection, to give them a better future. There are times when I feel lost or unsure of where I am in the world, and I just remind myself of my father's legacy of giving, of sharing with others. So today, we continue that tradition with awarding the Tony Stark Award to someone who helps us build a better future, to Adam Ware. And of course, everybody claps while Madame Masque is effectively watching on. And so at that point, you pick up with the banquet, right? The whole dinner afterwards. And as you guys know, you kind of see Tony Stark, right, being drawn off to the side. That's one of the things I love about how this comic is handled. Tony Stark, as a lot of you guys know, likes to protect people. He's a superhero, but in so many ways, he doesn't see himself as part of the world. He kind of sees himself isolated from the world, not because he chooses to be, but because in a lot of ways, he's a futurist, and most people on the planet are not nearly as intelligent as he is. A good example of this is like Reed Richards, right? It's not to say that Reed Richards is less intelligent than Tony Stark, but Tony Stark is always looking to the future. He's always looking to the horizon. There have been ample stories in Marvel Comics where they clearly illustrate the fact that when it comes to mechanics, when it comes to engineering, when it comes to looking to the horizon, Tony Stark is way beyond Reed Richards. It's one of these weird and wonky moments. And in fact, that was the whole point that was made by Jonathan Hickman at the end of Avengers and New Avengers when you have Iron Man and Captain America fighting. When Captain America tells Tony Stark, you knew the whole time. And Tony says, yes, I knew the whole time. But I knew that nobody else out there would see it. I knew nobody else would focus on it. Like Reed Richards runs on hope, that kind of thing. So yeah, I knew this was the end logical result. It was too big. I knew that the moment we sat down and Reed Richards explained the nature of the incursions. At that point, my mind started going in the direction of how do I convince everybody to focus on something else and accept the fact that the end is nigh without society going crazy and destroying itself. So it was kind of nuts. It's a really cool element to Tony Stark's character in Marvel and very easily overlooked. But that's where he's just kind of sitting there eating and disgusted by the food that he's being fed. And somebody just says, I know that look, right? You're debating ordering off menu, aren't you? Right? And this girl just says, but I'm a step ahead of you. Normally, I don't care who the party's for. I don't allow that. But for the man of the hour, I thought I could make an exception. And so he just says, my favorite, right? You made this just for me. Who are you? Because it's just burger and fries. And she says, Luna Lucia. And I didn't get the impression a guy who has a biker jacket and hover bike wanted caviar. And so he just asks her, right? Like, you want to get out of here? And she's like, just like that? And he's like, yeah, just like that, you know? And so she's like, sorry, I don't date dangerous men. And he's like, you wound me, right? What makes you think I'm dangerous? And she's like, because I'm always attracted to dangerous men. And gives him a wink. Now, Had there not been a massive explosion off to the side, 100%, man, Tony Stark would have taken this girl home. Right? Like, they would have been back at his place touching naughty bits, and that would have been the end of that. But this huge explosion comes by way of Madame Masque showing up here, blowing a hole in the joint, and Advanced Idea Mechanics attacking with her. And she's like, a celebration of the best and brightest, and you don't invite me. I guess Advanced Idea Mechanics invitation got lost in the mail, but it's fine. We throw better parties anyway. And that's where Tony just says, Madame Masque, right? Put down the gun. What is this? Ghost of X's past? Did Emma Frost forget to show up too? And that's where Whitney's just like, cute, right? Take her. Because they're taking Pepper Potts. Now, anybody who knows anything about the Iron Man mythos knows you can steal Tony Stark's armor, you can besmirch his name, you can graffiti his armor if you want to, but if there's any one thing you do not do, you do not go after Pepper Potts. Whether she and Tony are together or not is irrelevant. And so at that point he says, Melinda, what is Madame Masque doing with AIM? And Melinda just says, my sources said that after that gang business in New York, Madame Masque tag teamed with the High Council for a new division. I'm calling for backup. And that's where Tony just says, don't bother, right? And he immediately goes after Madame Masque and all of her AIM guys. And that's where he just like fires up his suit of armor. And Melinda gets kind of pissy, right? She was like, you brought armor. And he's like, that's the whole thing, Melinda. I lie and you catch me in the lie. You can give me a hard time about it after I stop Madame Masque and save Pepper, because this is one of those moments that Melinda hasn't figured out yet, where we're past the point of Tony Stark jokes. This is when he gets serious. So the last thing to do is chastise him over the fact that he didn't bring armor, because he doesn't really care, right? That's completely irrelevant to him, right? And so that's where he says, you guys should really change your name to BIM, right? Bad Idea Mechanics. Not only that, Pepper Potts isn't helpless. Pepper Potts is trained with some of the most prodigious fighters within the Marvel Universe, and where she's by no means equivalent to Black Widow in terms of her fighting capabilities, she can certainly give you a good black eye, right? Like, she knows how to put a haymaker on somebody, and that's exactly what she did, right? She just like cold cocks one of the AIM agents and literally goes to jump out of the Jeep. And at that point, Madame Masque grabs her, right? And is like, you really don't want to get hurt doing that. But of course, this leads to Tony Stark grabbing Pepper Potts. And then in turn, you have Tony who asks Madame Masque, what the hell, right? Kidnapping, working with AIM? And when he just tells him, you know all about mergers. I had a new idea, and AIM has the resources to pull it off. You should be proud. I was inspired by you. Inspired by a new nightmare. And then immediately just starts hissing, right? All this smoke coming out of her. And then at that point, Tony's just like, oh my God. He's like, Pepper, get back. And at that point, Madame Masque explodes. She blows up. Now, the idea of the new nightmare is clearly a reference to Matt Fraction's Iron Man run, specifically the Five Nightmares storyline, which was an incredible storyline. For those of you guys who never read Five Nightmares, I'm pretty sure we covered it. I'll dig through the playlist to see if we have. And if we haven't, then, I'll go ahead and cover it for the modern era, but it's a really amazing story, right? But once Madame Masque basically explodes, Pepper asks the question, right? What the hell is going on? Did she just blow herself up? And Tony's just like, hold your tears, Pep, right? Life model decoys. And he says, if I can get them back to my workshop, I can investigate. And that's where he gets a call from Melinda, right? And she just says, you got damsel in distress, right? The chaos and AIM taking Pepper was all a distraction to get you away. And Tony asks for what? And she says, Madame Masque was after someone else. They were after Adam Ware. And so they end up like taking Adam down underground into these sewers, right? He's like, what in the heck is this? And he just says, I'm just a teacher, right? I can't do anything for you. I specialize in education resources, problem solving. And that's where Whitney tells him, don't be so hard on yourself. You were handpicked by Tony Stark. AIM expects great things from you if you survive. And so at that point, you switch over to New Mexico to the new base of operations that Tony Stark has, and what used to be the old Hulk bunker, where they used to keep him prisoner, specifically after World War Hulk. For those of you guys who don't know, there was a time period in Marvel when World War Hulk ended, and Bruce Banner was just reverted back to his Banner form. He was housed down in New Mexico, like literally 3 miles underground. That's where you go into the Red Hulk storyline, and then eventually Bruce Banner comes back, and that's where you go into the Red and Green Hulk storyline. So it was a bit of a wonky era in the Hulk mythos, just in terms of continuity and following the comics, but the point is, once they get down into the laboratory, Tony Stark's blasting his music as loud as it can possibly go, because the reality here is that it just kind of helps him focus on whatever it is that he's doing. But that's where Pepper tells him, right, I hope you've been focused on what AIM is up to, because they took Adam Ware. And he just says, I know, I was there. And she's like, you have to find him. And he says, I know. And she says, you know something else else, don't you? And he says, I always know something. Look, listen, and learn. Now, the look on his face, the scenario, it's not a time for jokes. This is Tony at his most serious. And he just says, our party was not the only location AIM hit last night. Our yellow beekeepers of chaos made 11 appearances around the world, all at the same time. It was a massive, coordinated attack that resulted in multiple kidnappings. Some people were literally taken from their homes. And he asks, you see the pattern here. And that's where Pepper says Julia Appleton, Daniel Buss. And then she realizes what's going on. And Melinda doesn't really seem to understand what's happening. And Pepper fills her in. They were all people who were up for the Tony Stark Award. And Tony says, AIM took people that I handpicked. Me. People who I thought were smart and creative enough to work with Iron Man. This is my fault. Now, here's the interesting thing here. This does not seem to be one of those times where Tony blames himself because he's a narcissist. It seems like one of these times where Tony blames himself because he truly is at fault. Because Pepper asked the question, what is this, Tony? Why would Masque kidnap a bunch of scientists and teachers? And Tony just like takes off in the Iron Man suit and says, I'm gonna find him. Right, Melinda, you need to gather as much info on AIM from your people as you can. I am going to visit every single AIM headquarters in the world and beyond until I bring all of them home, because AIM actually operates not only in other parts of the universe, but in other dimensions as well. At least they have at different points in time. It's how they found Hyperion, for example, right? Peeking into other realities during the collapse of the multiverse. But he says, Pepper, can you contact the families of the kidnapped and let them know we have everything under control? And so Pepper just asks, right? I mean, what are you talking about? What did you mean when you said this was your fault? And like, what did you do? But Tony cuts her off and just says, I'm going invisible. Call you soon. Do not wait up. And like ends the phone call. Then at that point, he jumps on another line. He says, secure channel, code word, scarlet letter. And he's told radio secure. And he says, emergency meeting now. And at that point, you find out he's talking to Captain America. And it's actually dope to know that like Tony and Steve Rogers have a kind of built-in secret line of communication, right? And it takes like 3 steps. Right? Secure channel, code word, scarlet letter, radio secure, emergency meeting now. That's it. It happens that fast. I love that that exists in Marvel. And so when Steve picks up, he's like, Tony? And Tony just says, Steve, listen, I know the Illuminati disbanded, but can you meet me at the old location? And Steve just says, that's a tall order, Tony. And Tony just responds, I might have made a mistake. A long time ago, I had an idea, a new nightmare, and I set up certain contingencies in case it happened. And I think AIM has them. I need to talk in person. And so Steve just says, okay, fine, but meet me in New York instead. Over and out. So Tony Stark races off. And when he does, Captain America turns around and talks to people that we can't see. And he says, I take it that you all caught that. You were right. We have a problem. Which begs the question, how do we take down Tony Stark? Because seemingly, this is the new Illuminati. You got War Machine, Reed Richards, Susan Storm. It looks like Amadeus Cho and Carol Danvers. Here's my question that I had for you guys. Is that Norman Osborn? Or is that Harry Osborn? It looks like Harry Osborn, to be honest with you guys. Now, we don't definitively know this is the new Illuminati, but it looks like it is. And the question is, what's Harry doing there? There's never been a version of the Illuminati that had Harry Osborn on it, if it's him. I'm excited to see where this goes, man. Joshua Williamson's handling of Iron Man so far is incredible. I can't wait to see where it goes from here. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.